Alexander Grayson had built an empire on discipline and control. Nothing in his world happened by chance. Every decision was calculated, every risk measured. But all of that shattered the moment two identical boys stepped in front of him, their bright blue eyes locked onto his. "You're Alexander Grayson, right?" one of them asked. Before he could respond, the second boy spoke, his voice calm, certain. "We've been looking for you." Alexander frowned, his instincts immediately on alert. "Why?" The first boy hesitated for only a second before delivering the words that would change everything. "Because you're our dad." Alexander Grayson stepped out of his towering office building, his mind already focused on the next deal waiting for him. The sharp evening air did little to distract him from the numbers running through his head, the negotiations he needed to finalize, and the endless demands of his company. He thrived in control, in structure, in the power that came with knowing he was the one calling the shots. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, barely noticing the people passing by. He wasn't a man who paid attention to the world around him unless it directly impacted his business. But something made him stop that evening. A strange feeling crept over him, an instinct he couldn't quite explain. Someone was watching him. His sharp blue eyes scanned the busy sidewalk, expecting to find a journalist, an employee who didn't have the courage to approach him, maybe even a competitor sizing him up. Instead, he saw them. Two boys stood a few feet away, identical in every way. They couldn't have been older than 7, with neatly combed blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, the same shade as his own. They wore matching jackets, their hands stuffed into their pockets as they stared at him with an expression that sent an unexpected chill through his spine. Alexander felt his stomach tighten, though he wasn't sure why. He had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing like this. The two boys exchanged a glance before one of them, the slightly taller one, took a hesitant step forward. "Are you Alexander Grayson?" His name sounded strange coming from such a small voice. It was a question, but there was no uncertainty in it. The boy already knew the answer. Alexander straightened his posture, his business instincts kicking in. He had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but he had never been a man caught off guard for long. "Yes," he answered carefully. "Who are you?" The second boy stepped closer, his hands still deep in his pockets. He studied Alexander in a way no child ever had before, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Then, with a calmness that didn't belong to someone so young, he said, "We've been looking for you." Alexander's entire body tensed. Something about their tone, about the way they stood so still, made his heartbeat pick up slightly. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, anticipating their moves before they even made them. But he couldn't read these boys. "And why is that?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The first boy hesitated before answering. "Because you're our dad." For the first time in years, Alexander Grayson had no words. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as Alexander stared at the two boys standing in front of him. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, struggled to process what had just been said. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating deals worth billions, outmaneuvering competitors, and making decisions that shaped entire industries. Yet, in this moment, he found himself completely unprepared. The boys didn't flinch under his intense gaze. There was no hesitation in their posture, no trace of uncertainty in their expressions. They weren't confused, scared, or nervous. They simply stood there, waiting for his response, as if they had rehearsed this moment 100 times before. Alexander cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain control, but his voice still came out rougher than he intended. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if doing so would somehow change reality. "You must be mistaken." The slightly taller boy, the one who had spoken first, tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "We're not mistaken," he said calmly, as if he had already prepared for this exact reaction. "Our mom told us about you." At the mention of their mother, something cold settled in Alexander's stomach. He didn't need to ask who she was. He already knew. There had only been one woman in his life who had ever truly mattered, one woman who had slipped through his fingers before he even realized what he had lost. Lauren Harris. The name burned at the edges of his mind, bringing with it memories he had buried deep beneath the relentless pursuit of his career. He had met her before his company had become an empire, before his name had carried the weight it did now. She had been the only person who had ever looked at him as more than a businessman, the only one who had made him feel something beyond ambition. And he had let her go. His jaw tightened as he forced himself to focus on the present, on the two boys who were still waiting for him to say something. He wanted to deny it outright, to tell them they had the wrong man, that this was some ridiculous mistake, but the moment he looked at them again, he knew he couldn't. The resemblance was too strong. The blonde hair, the sharp features, the piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own, it was undeniable. His pulse pounded in his ears as he inhaled deeply, his voice quieter now. "Where is your mother?" The second boy, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice softer but just as steady. "She's in the hospital," he said, his fingers tightening around the edge of his jacket. "She's sick." Alexander felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, controlled exhale, but it did nothing to ease the sudden tightness in his chest. Lauren was in the hospital. She had never reached out, never told him about them, never given him the chance to know that he had two sons. She had kept them away from him for 7 years, had raised them without him, had built a life that didn't include him, and now she was sick. His voice was measured when he spoke again, though it took everything in him to keep it steady. "Take me to her." The boys exchanged a glance, as if communicating without words, before nodding in unison. They turned without hesitation, leading him down the street, their movements in perfect sync, as if they had spent their entire lives preparing for this exact moment. Alexander followed, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answers to. The drive to the hospital was silent, but the air inside the car was thick with unspoken tension. Alexander sat behind the wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary, his knuckles white from the pressure. His mind raced through every possibility, every unanswered question that had surfaced the moment the boys had spoken their mother's name. He wanted to demand answers, to ask them how long she had been sick, why she had never told him about them, why she had chosen to raise them alone rather than come to him. But he held back, knowing that pressing them now wouldn't do any good. The boys sat in the back, side by side, their movements eerily in sync. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't seem particularly nervous. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear or uncertainty. It was more like they were waiting, as if they already knew how this was going to play out and had accepted it long before he had even known they existed. The hospital came into view, its white walls and bright lights a stark contrast to the darkness settling in the sky above. Alexander pulled into the parking lot, his pulse pounding as he turned off the engine. He had been in hospitals before, but always for business meetings with investors, charitable donations, or ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new medical wings his company had funded. Never for something that mattered. Never for something personal. The boys unbuckled their seat belts and climbed out of the car without hesitation. Alexander followed, his steps feeling heavier than they should as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and sterilized air, the kind of scent that clung to everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as they made their way through the corridors. The boys led him with an ease that suggested they had done this many times before, weaving through the hallways with a sense of familiarity that made his chest tighten. When they reached a door near the end of the hall, one of the boys, he still hadn't learned which was which, paused and looked up at him. "She's tired a lot," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Sometimes she's asleep." Alexander nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him when they stepped inside. Lauren was lying in the hospital bed, her body thinner than he remembered, her face pale but still unmistakably hers. The vibrant, fiery woman he had once known looked fragile now, her dark blonde hair slightly disheveled against the stark white pillow. Her eyes were closed, her breathing even but weak. For a moment, he couldn't move. He had spent years convincing himself that she had left because she hadn't wanted the life he had chosen. He had told himself that she had walked away because she had never truly loved him, that she had seen the man he was becoming and had decided she didn't want to be a part of it. But now, looking at her lying there, he realized how little he had truly understood. The boys moved to the side of the bed, one of them reaching for her hand, his small fingers curling around hers with a familiarity that made Alexander's chest tighten. Lauren stirred at the touch, her eyelids fluttering open slowly. Her green eyes, still as striking as ever, focused on the boys first, and she offered them a tired but warm smile. Then, her gaze shifted, and the moment she saw him standing there, her entire body tensed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said his name. Alexander. His throat felt dry when he finally found his voice. You should have told me. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. He took a step closer, his pulse hammering. 7 years, Lauren. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, steady, filled with the weight of everything he had just learned. 7 years, and you never told me I had sons. Lauren's fingers twitched against the sheets, her expression shifting, something unreadable flickering in her tired eyes. I wanted to, she admitted, her voice hoarse. I almost did, so many times. Then why didn't you? She exhaled shakily, her gaze dropping to the bed before looking back up at him. Because I thought you wouldn't want them. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Alexander inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He had expected excuses, justifications, maybe even anger. He hadn't expected this. Lauren swallowed hard. You had your company, your empire, everything you worked for. I didn't want to be the one who held you back. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You think I wouldn't have wanted them? His voice was lower now, rougher. You think I would have turned my back on my own children? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I didn't know, Alexander. I didn't know if you could ever be anything other than the man who put work before everything. He felt something crack inside him, something he had spent years carefully holding together. I had a right to know, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. Lauren let out a breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. The boys, who had remained quiet the entire time, exchanged a glance before looking back at their mother. We found him, one of them said softly. Like you told us to. Alexander frowned slightly, turning to look at them. What do you mean? Lauren closed her eyes for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again. I told them, if anything ever happened to me, they should go to you. His heart clenched. You were always going to tell them? She nodded. When they were older. When I was sure they wouldn't feel like a burden to you. He stared at her, struggling to comprehend how she could have believed such a thing. They are not a burden, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And neither are you. Lauren blinked, her breath hitching slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face before looking at the boys again. He had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped industries, controlling the outcome of everything he touched. But this? This was the one thing he had never seen coming. Yet, as he stood in that hospital room, looking at the 2 boys who had sought him out, at the woman who had once meant everything to him, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. The weight of the moment pressed down on Alexander as he sat in the hospital room, the beeping of machines and the distant murmur of voices in the hallway fading into background noise. His world had just shifted in a way he never could have predicted, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. Lauren lay back against the pillows, looking exhausted but alert. Her green eyes held a mixture of emotions, regret, uncertainty, and something else he couldn't quite define. The boys sat on either side of her bed, their small hands resting on the blanket as if they could somehow protect her just by being close. Alexander exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. He had come here demanding answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do with them. The past couldn't be rewritten. The 7 years he had missed with his sons were lost forever. But there was still the present, still the future, and for the first time, he realized that walking away wasn't an option. Lauren spoke first, her voice quieter than before. "What are you thinking?" He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "That I don't even know where to start." She gave him a tired, almost sad smile. "Neither do I." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said in years. Finally, he turned to the boys. They were watching him carefully, their expressions unreadable, but there was curiosity in their eyes. He had spent his life reading people, predicting their next moves, but he couldn't read his own sons. "You knew about me?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The taller of the two, who seemed to be the more confident one, nodded. "Mom told us your name. She showed us pictures." His chest tightened. "And you still came looking for me?" The second boy, who had been quieter so far, lifted his chin slightly. "You were supposed to find us." The words hit him harder than he expected. Lauren sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I never wanted them to feel like they didn't have a father," she admitted. "I wanted them to know who you were. I thought I had more time to figure out how to tell you." Alexander clenched his jaw, suppressing the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he had been kept in the dark or the realization that his sons had spent years believing he had chosen not to find them. He turned back to them. "I didn't know," he said, his voice firm. "If I had, I would have been here." The boys exchanged a glance, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Alexander knew trust wouldn't come easily. He had spent years building an empire, but now he was starting from scratch in something far more important. "I want to make up for the time I lost," he said, looking at both of them. "If you'll let me." Lauren's eyes softened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say that. One of the boys shifted in his seat. "What does that mean?" Alexander inhaled slowly, measuring his words. "It means I don't want to just disappear now that I know about you. It means I want to be in your lives." The boys didn't respond right away. They were thinking, processing. Lauren cleared her throat. "I don't know how long I'll be in here, but they need someone to take care of them." Alexander straightened. "Then they'll come with me." The statement was so firm, so final, that even Lauren looked surprised. "You mean that?" she asked. He met her gaze. "They're my sons, Lauren. I'm not leaving them." For the first time, one of the boys smiled, small, cautious, but real. The other still looked unsure, but he didn't protest. Lauren let out a slow breath, nodding. "Okay." Alexander looked at the boys again. "Is that okay with you?" They both studied him for a moment before the taller one nodded. "Yeah." His brother hesitated a second longer, then nodded too. Alexander felt something shift inside him. He had spent his whole life building walls, keeping emotions at bay, convincing himself that he didn't need anything more than his success. But now, for the first time, he realized he had been missing something far more important. And he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers again. Alexander had spent years making decisions with absolute confidence. He had built a business empire from the ground up, faced ruthless competitors, and negotiated some of the most complex deals in the industry. But nothing had prepared him for this, driving 2 7-year-old boys to his home, knowing that from this moment forward, nothing in his life would ever be the same. The ride was quiet. The twins sat in the back seat, their small faces illuminated by the soft glow of passing streetlights. They weren't fidgeting, nor did they speak much, but they were watching him. Observing. Studying him the same way he had studied boardroom rivals for years. Alexander wasn't sure if it was unsettling or impressive. His house was a stark contrast to the hospital they had just left. The sleek glass walls, modern furniture, and spotless floors reflected a life built for a man who had never planned on sharing his space with anyone. The boys stepped inside cautiously, their heads tilting upward as they took in the massive ceilings and expensive artwork. One of them, the more talkative one, broke the silence first. "You live here alone?" Alexander nodded, setting his keys on the marble counter. "Yes." The other twin, quieter but just as observant, glanced at his brother before looking back at Alexander. "It's really big." Alexander didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought about his house in terms of size, only function. It was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, and certainly not for children. He turned toward them. "Are you hungry?" The twins exchanged another glance before the talkative one nodded. "A little." Alexander exhaled, walking toward the kitchen. He had no idea what kids ate. His own meals were prepared by staff or ordered in, designed for convenience rather than enjoyment. He opened the fridge and frowned at its contents: bottled water, high-protein meals, and a few untouched fruits. He glanced back at them. "What do you usually eat?" The quieter twin finally spoke. "Mom made pancakes for dinner sometimes." Alexander hesitated. "Pancakes?" The first twin nodded. "She said breakfast food tastes better at night." For a moment, Alexander didn't move. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the simplicity of their answer caught him off guard. He had spent the last few hours trying to figure out how to introduce himself into their lives, how to prove he belonged, how to fix the years he had lost. And now, standing in his own kitchen, he realized the answer might be as simple as pancakes. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and searched for a recipe. He wasn't the type to cook, he had never needed to, but he could follow instructions. The boys watched as he gathered ingredients, measuring out flour and cracking eggs into a bowl with calculated precision. The first twin climbed onto one of the bar stools, resting his chin on his hand. "You don't cook much, do you?" Alexander smirked slightly, stirring the batter. "What gave it away?" The other twin, still standing, shrugged. "You look like you're making a business deal with the eggs." For the first time all day, Alexander let out a genuine laugh. It was short, unexpected, and completely foreign to him. But it was real. The twins grinned, as if pleased with themselves for getting that reaction out of him. When the pancakes were finally done, he set the plates in front of them and waited. The first twin took a bite and nodded. "Not bad." The second took a more thoughtful approach, chewing slowly before looking up. "Not as good as Mom's." Alexander smirked. "I figured." They ate in comfortable silence, the first real moment of normalcy since everything had changed. The boys weren't as tense as before, their guard lowering slightly with each bite. After a while, one of them looked up. "Are we staying here now?" Alexander met his gaze. "For as long as you want." The other twin, usually the quieter one, studied him carefully. "Do you want us here?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't used to saying things that weren't carefully measured and controlled. Finally, he set down his fork and met both of their gazes. "Yes." The boys didn't say anything right away, but something shifted. The tension in their shoulders eased just a little. They didn't fully trust him yet. He knew that would take time. But at least now, they believed him. The first night with the twins in his home was unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. His house, once filled only with the hum of electronics and the occasional clink of glassware from late-night drinks, now carried the soft sounds of two 7-year-olds moving through unfamiliar space. The twins didn't talk much after dinner. They explored the house cautiously, as if unsure whether they truly belonged here, and Alexander found himself watching them more than he intended. It was strange, the way they carried themselves. There was no wild energy, no reckless curiosity that he expected from kids their age. They were careful, thoughtful, observant in a way that made it clear they had learned to read people long before they should have needed to. They reminded him of himself, always analyzing, always waiting to see how a situation might unfold before committing to it. He showed them to the guest rooms, identical in layout but different in decor. He hadn't expected them to hesitate, hadn't expected the look they exchanged when he motioned toward the separate rooms. It wasn't until the quieter twin shifted uncomfortably that Alexander realized what was wrong. "We usually share a room," the boy admitted, his voice quieter than before. The other twin nodded. "Mom said it made us stronger. That way, we were never alone." Something tightened in Alexander's chest at those words, but he didn't let it show. Without hesitation, he gestured toward one of the rooms. "Then you can stay together here. I'll have the other one changed in case you ever want your own space." The boys seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding in unison. As they stepped inside, Alexander hesitated at the doorway. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to say something, wasn't sure what the right words were. He had never put anyone to bed before. He had never needed to. "Do you need anything?" he finally asked, feeling unfamiliar with the question even as he spoke it. The taller twin shook his head. The quieter one hesitated before asking, "Is it okay if we leave the door open?" Alexander nodded without hesitation. "Of course." They climbed into bed, still fully dressed, and Alexander made a mental note to buy them proper clothes in the morning. He reached for the light switch, then paused. "Good night." The twins looked at him for a long moment before one of them finally muttered, "Good night." Alexander stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, and walked down the hall to his own bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at the floor. His entire life had changed in a matter of hours. He had gone from being a man who had everything under control to standing in the middle of his own house, wondering how to be a father to two boys who had spent their lives without him. There was no contract to sign, no negotiation to make this easier. He had missed 7 years. And for the first time, he realized just how much those years had mattered. The next morning, he woke early, a habit ingrained in him from years of running his company. By the time he made it downstairs, the twins were already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter, flipping through a magazine that had been left on the table. They looked up when he walked in, their blue eyes expectant but cautious. "I figured we'd go shopping today," Alexander said, reaching for a cup to pour himself coffee. "You need clothes. Whatever else you want, too." The boys exchanged another glance, communicating silently the way they always seemed to. "We don't need much," one of them finally said. Alexander frowned slightly, setting his cup down. "That's not the point." The other twin studied him for a moment before nodding. The shopping trip was another reminder of how much he had missed. The boys didn't run through aisles or grab things impulsively. They chose clothes with careful consideration, as if each item was a luxury they weren't used to. When he told them they could pick out books, toys, or anything else they wanted, they hesitated before selecting only a few things, all small, all practical. It wasn't until they reached the checkout line that Alexander realized just how much they had been raised to take only what they needed, never more. On the drive home, he broke the silence. "You don't have to be careful about what you take," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to ask permission for things that are yours." The twins didn't answer right away. Finally, the quieter one spoke. "We just don't want to be a problem." Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're not," he said firmly. "You never were." The boys didn't say anything else, but in the rearview mirror, he saw them exchange another silent glance. He knew trust wouldn't come overnight. But for the first time, he felt like they were starting to believe him. The first few days passed in a way that felt almost surreal to Alexander. He had built his life around precision and efficiency, every moment of his day carefully scheduled, every decision calculated. Now, for the first time in years, his routine had been disrupted, not by an unexpected business crisis or a last-minute negotiation, but by two 7-year-old boys who were trying to figure out where they belonged in his world. He woke up earlier than usual, though not because of work. The quiet sounds of the twins moving through the house, their soft voices carrying from the hallway, were enough to stir him from sleep. He wasn't used to other people in his space, let alone children, but he found himself listening for them anyway, making sure they were still there. Breakfast was an adjustment. The boys ate quickly, as if they weren't sure how long the food would last, their eyes flicking to him now and then, as if expecting some kind of reprimand. It took Alexander a few meals to realize that they weren't used to eating without a sense of urgency, that they had spent too long being careful with what they took. By the third morning, he spoke up. "You can slow down. There's plenty of food." The boys exchanged one of their silent glances before nodding, but old habits weren't easily broken. Alexander didn't push. The real challenge, however, wasn't in the small moments. It was in the fact that he had no idea what he was doing. He had built companies, structured deals that had shaped industries, made decisions that impacted thousands of lives, but he had never once been responsible for children. He had spent the first few days observing them, trying to understand them the way he would any business situation. He noticed that they never asked for anything, that they stuck close to each other in unfamiliar places, that they never quite let their guard down. They weren't difficult or demanding, but they carried themselves with a carefulness that unsettled him. He wanted to change that. On the fourth day, he made a decision. After breakfast, he leaned against the kitchen counter, studying them for a moment before speaking. "What do you two do for fun?" The boys looked up from their plates, clearly caught off guard by the question. They glanced at each other before one of them finally answered. "We read sometimes." The other nodded. "And we play chess." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Chess?" The quieter twin shrugged. "Mom taught us." It took him a moment to process that. He hadn't expected that answer, but it made sense. Lauren had always believed in challenging the mind, in making sure her children could think for themselves. It was something he had once admired about her. "All right," Alexander said. "Let's play." The twins exchanged another one of their silent looks before nodding. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it became clear within the first few moves that they weren't just playing for fun. They were good. Calculated. They didn't rush their turns, didn't make careless mistakes. They read him the way he tried to read them, anticipating his moves with an unsettling level of precision. When one of them finally won, Alexander leaned back slightly, studying the board before looking at them. "You didn't just learn this from your mom, did you?" The quieter twin shook his head. "We used to play in the library. Against older people. They let us practice." Alexander nodded slowly, something tightening in his chest. They had learned strategy the same way he had, by necessity. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw before speaking again. "You don't have to be careful here." The boys froze slightly, their gazes flicking up to him. "You don't have to measure every move before you make it," he continued. "You don't have to watch each other to see what's safe. You don't have to figure everything out on your own." They didn't respond right away, but he could tell they were thinking about his words, weighing them the way they weighed every decision they made. After a long pause, one of them finally nodded. "Okay." Alexander didn't push for more. Trust wasn't something that could be built in a few days. But for the first time, he felt like they were starting to believe him. The morning started differently than the ones before. For the first time since the twins had arrived, Alexander didn't wake up to the sound of quiet movements in the hallway or the hushed voices of two boys trying not to disturb him. Instead, he woke to laughter. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but as he pushed himself upright, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he realized it was coming from downstairs. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the sound itself or the fact that it was coming from them. He had spent the past week learning more about his sons than he had known possible. He had studied them the way he studied business deals, analyzing their habits, their silences, their unspoken language. They had been careful in the beginning, watching him just as much as he was watching them, waiting to see if this was real, if he was going to change his mind, if they could trust him. But now, hearing their laughter drifting up the stairs, he felt something shift. By the time he made it downstairs, he found them sitting at the kitchen counter, surrounded by what looked like an attempt at making breakfast. There was flour on the counter, an open box of pancake mix, and a mess of cracked eggshells beside a mixing bowl that looked only half stirred. One of the twins noticed him first, pausing with a spoon in his hand. "You're awake." The other turned, looking just as guilty. "We were trying to make pancakes." Alexander crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow as he took in the disaster they had created. "Is this a strategic attack on my kitchen?" One of them smirked slightly. "You don't have much food." "We had to work with what we found." Alexander let out a breath, shaking his head. "You could have asked." The quieter twin shrugged. "We didn't want to bother you." The words were casual, but they hit him harder than he expected. He walked over to the counter, reaching for the mixing bowl and taking the spoon from them. "Next time, you ask," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. "You're not bothering me." The twins exchanged a glance before nodding. It was a small thing, but Alexander knew it mattered. They spent the next half hour fixing the mess they had made, turning it into something edible. The pancakes were far from perfect, slightly uneven and a little too thick, but the twins didn't seem to mind. They sat across from him at the dining table, eating with more ease than they had on their first day here. They weren't rushing, weren't measuring how much they were taking, weren't glancing at him like they were waiting for a reaction. When they finished, one of them leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "Are you going to go back to work today?" Alexander set down his fork, studying them. It wasn't just an idle question. "Not today," he said. The other twin frowned slightly. "Don't you have important things to do?" Alexander nodded. "I do." They waited, expecting him to list off meetings or phone calls, but instead, he just leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "But this is more important." They didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with matching expressions of uncertainty, as if they weren't sure whether they believed him. Then, after a long pause, one of them nodded. "Okay." Alexander knew it wasn't everything. It wasn't immediate trust, wasn't years of absence erased overnight, wasn't a perfect, picture book ending. But it was something. And for the first time, he felt like they were beginning to choose him, too.